Hello, my name is Connor.
And I'm Jason.
And you are listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast.
So I want to welcome you back, and we are in Matthew 9 today. If you've been following along, we have been walking with Jesus, looking over his shoulder, giving dignity to the people surrounding, a little more contextually focused in terms of the culture, like what's happening in the proverbial room. Now, when you do any kind of chronological follow, if you don't know this, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called synoptic gospels, which means there's similarity between them. John is very different in timeline and has different stories. But even Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they include things in different pacing. So sometimes it's eye of the beholder, which comes before what. But we're going to dip back to Matthew 9 and talk about the calling of Matthew. So we're in Matthew 9, verse 9. And so kind of to get us thinking, anything that pops up in your mind that might help us culturally look around the room?
Yeah, so I mean, I think probably most people within the sound of my voice will have, we've talked about it. I'm sure you've heard 1,000 people talk about it. The position that tax collectors were held in by the people of Jesus' day. Tax collectors were routinely people from the towns and cultures that the Roman Empire was oppressing, and so these were Jewish people that had turned against their people and sided with Rome, and were levying taxes upon their fellow countrymen, and then also most of the time skimming money off the top and becoming wealthy themselves. So just utterly and completely despised. The Jewish people considered them vermin, traitors. There's hard to even imagine. I think we've said before, it'd be similar, imagine China invades the United States, and then Jake down the block is suddenly the guy who is coming and collecting your taxes. Maybe that kind of gets a mindset of what it would be like to have this sort of betrayal. But yeah, these people would have just been well known. They would have been despised. They would have been seen as everything. If there was a Messiah to come, he needs to come because of people like the tax collectors, because of how vile and evil and the sort of things that they're introducing into Israel.
Yeah, I like that. And while you're talking, it just stirred in me, who are my tax collectors? It is fascinating. The hero of the story, whatever story you're reading, whoever the hero chooses becomes kind of your hero, or at least liked by the hero, validated, vetted maybe by the hero. So when I hear tax collector, I don't think of IRS worker. Today I think of, the people in the Bible that Jesus blessed and the narrow-minded people that didn't accept them. But the truth of the matter, who are my tax collectors? Who are the people that have power over me? Not just that I don't like, but in my mind, they have no business being in power over me. Mm-hmm. That helps me take on whatever message we're going to pick up here.
And imagine those people have a power over you and are using that power to gain status, gain money at the expense of you and your children.
Right.
And when you look at your child who is not eating the way they should, and then you look up the metaphorical hill to the tax collector, and his children eat great. His life is fine. He doesn't struggle the same way that you're struggling.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I do think it's really useful. I mean, we could take this from a lot of angles. Obviously we've chosen looking at the text and saying what amazes and what perplexes us. But I think it's interesting to think, if I'm in this situation, even back then, so if I transport myself, what am I afraid of? What excites me? What gives me contentedness in this situation? And then to take it now, how am I like the tax collector? How am I like the people that don't accept the tax collector? And really tapping into those very primal, what am I afraid of? What excites me? What am I hoping for? And I think that's really interesting, that thought of being at the bottom of the hill. And you see these people you care about in this metaphor, your children, but it's that idea of thinking, this is not right. Mm-hmm. And man, once I say that out loud, I think a lot of things aren't right in my world, so I can really relate to probably all sides of the story.
Man, that's fascinating. Especially going to be interesting to track that initial thought of looking up the hill and seeing somebody actively take advantage of their neighbor and having the thought, man, that's not right. And then seeing how quickly it turns into not just not just sinful, but ultimately unhelpful to you, and dehumanize how quickly that good thing to recognize can corrupt us when it becomes about our place and our status and our what we deserve.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start there in verse 9. As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," he told him. And Matthew got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." All right. So what amazes you about this, Connor?
The thing that truly amazes me is just the simplicity that I need to keep coming back to over and over and over again. That the Jesus that the God that Jesus represents, the God who Jesus is a God of mercy, and he is not a God. He's not a God of religious practices. He's not a God of religious rhythms. He is a God of mercy who desires to help heal the outsider, and rejects the insider's religiosity that repels the outsider. And it's amazing to me because it's so simple, and yet I need to be reminded of this so often. I can so quickly fall into the trap that the Pharisees fall into here. Because if I want to put on, it doesn't sound scandalous to me for somebody who loves Jesus to speak with an IRS agent or a tax collector. But there are lots of different kinds of people that, if I'm being honest with myself, I hear a Jesus follower goes and is hanging around them. If I don't know them incredibly well, I'm going to assume the worst, and I'm going to judge, and I'm going to have a lot of preconceived notions about what is happening there. And so the thing that amazes me is even though Jesus couldn't lay this out more simply, I need it simply because it is a simple concept that I just keep failing at.
Right. Yeah, and I get that. I think it is good pointing out in this, the way it's reading in my version, "For I have not come to call the right," or no, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. It's not the sacrifice I make, because it's very merciful for me to sacrifice for you. And you pointed this out, but I think I want to really emphasize, he's contrasting the mercy, like Connor said, he's contrasting the mercy through ritual practice. And if we translate that to, because they were, in Jewish times, they were literally sacrificing animals, and they had a very rigid schedule of what animal and what thing you're sacrificing, and when you do this and this kind of thing.
And then this is what matters. This is what matters to God.
Right.
And the holiness, the separateness, the way that this is done right is at the heart of what is most important to God.
Yeah, and it's really important to recognize it's not the religion the religion literally means binding back to God. It's not the practice that was the problem. It was making the practice God.
Yeah.
And that's what they had done.
And God helped establish it itself was not bad or evil or wrong. But what humans did to it, what humans made of it, takes something that was good and right when God established it and made it hideous and brutal, and ultimately help separate people, help push it, repel people away from God.
Right, exactly, and that's the issue here, and it's pretty consistent. If you spend time with Jesus, you recognize this is, when there's any interaction with Pharisees and people there, it's almost always around this. They're like, look, we're honoring the system, and Jesus is like, I'm honoring the person. I'm honoring, especially the person that's hurting, And to me, what's amazing is that clarity of, I've come for the well, or I've not come for the well or the healthy. I've come for the sick, and that is super interesting. And I could probably share this as my perplexion as well. But it is that idea, and it probably is the simplicity you're referencing, but just that thought that I think I look for the well, or at least the weller. If I walk into a situation, and this rarely happens, I can't think of an example, but there are 5 people that want my attention, I tend to, if I'm not thinking about Jesus specifically, I will move to the least demanding relationship, and I think it's pretty typical. The dynamic that keeps cliques moving is mostly I want to be in that group because it requires the least of me or has a payoff, one of those two things. And I think especially for people when you're not dealing with the cliques of like high school dynamics, where you got to be popular or there's great cost. In general, you're going to go to the path of least resistance. And I don't think Jesus thought that way, but certainly I do. I'm looking for the healthy. I'm looking for the well. And the truth of the matter is, compared to him, everyone was unhealthy. Everyone, everyone needed a healer, but he's talking about their self-perception. And because I've known this for so long time, to hear it for the first time, I think it would have been shocking that I'm like, okay, so he's not here for the healthy. Well, who's the healthy in this particular story? Well, clearly it's the Pharisees that are questioning. And it seems almost beside the point. They're asking him, why are you hanging out with these people? And the initial answer is like, now what? But I think a lot of his answers feel that way, or would feel that way if I was in context, because it doesn't seem to answer the question initially. Because like, okay, that's all well and good. Why are you with the tax collector? And he's like, you see the world through relational capital. You see the world through what is this going to take from me?
Sure.
And I see the world from the vantage point of what's the real need here.
Yeah, it's the idea that in the Pharisees' mind, when the Messiah came, the Messiah comes and sees all of the good religion that the Pharisees have practiced, and it's like you're having somebody over, you're having somebody share your house, they're going to sleep in your guest room, and you make sure it is like you get the good mattress in there, you get the best sheets, you lay it all out, you cook a great meal for them. You're like, I think in the Pharisees' mind, I think this is the dynamic Jesus is approaching, that would be the expectation. It's like, well, we are the ones who have prepared everything for you, Jesus. Like in the Pharisees' mind, like the thought was if they did a good enough job, if they helped correct a lot of the mistakes Israel had made, then God would send the Messiah sooner. And so the expectation is when the Messiah comes that who the Messiah is going to be the best friend of the Messiah is going to be the Pharisees, because like the Messiah is not going to come and like without the Pharisees. The Messiah is going to need the Pharisees because they're the one doing all the God stuff. They're the ones who have made this possible. And so there's even you think about the self-perception of what a Pharisee would feel like. They're like, well, like if you believed for God to move in this way to send the Messiah, we have to help correct all that's gone wrong in Israel, all the people that have turned away from God, turned away from the religion. Like that would be a not just the tax collector aspect of it, but the idea that like, well, what do you mean you're not staying at our house? Like you're going to stay at the house that didn't even know you were coming? You're going to go down the street to the person who has an air mattress? Like we have a king size bed for you. We've prepared. Like, what do you mean you're going to go stay at the person's house who smells like vaguely like cat pee? Like that's outrageous. Because like, why would you even come if not to be around us, not to be with us? And so, yeah, I think you drawing on that is really helpful for me, because it's easy, because I think we've heard so much of the context growing up in church, to try to get to the place of, okay, it would be scandalous. The tax collector element is scandalous, but then also going, the second element, it might even be more scandalous to the Pharisees. Yeah, I don't know. That I think that's clarifying for me.
Well, and that brings up what perplexes me, and it wasn't what perplexed me a minute ago, but hearing you talk, I'm like, however something happens, you think, well, that's the only way it can happen. You know what I mean? But when you really think about it, it's like, oh, there's a billion ways to get here, and that's what makes our lives amazing. Like how many ways, even if you're listening to this and thinking, there's all these things I don't like about my life, and I'm all for asking God about it and watching for opportunity to change those things. But there's so many things that could have taken you in all kinds of different directions, So with that in mind, the Pharisees, and I don't want to exonerate them and I don't want to condemn them. I just trying to see this as objectively as possible. But there is a way without much imagination that basically, why didn't Jesus go to them and give them the right of refusal, as it were? You know what I mean? Why not go to them and say, you have been doing God's work? Their desire, I mean, and there are some that are completely consumed with their own arrogance and egotism, selfishness.
Yeah.
I get that. But I do think there's a piece, and I'm not saying, I don't think this disagrees with Jesus at all, that they're just afraid.
Yeah.
They're really afraid, and they believe exactly what you said. If we clean this up, God will send the Messiah, and the first order of business is free us from being under oppression, which is what always blows my mind is, how is this not introduced? Like Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, none of them say you're entering a time of oppression. Like you got to read between the lines to figure that out,
Well, and even that, I do wonder, like, why. I think there's a few reasons probably why they don't introduce it. But you think about, it almost would be the given. Most of the people that are accepting Jesus early on when the Gospels were written were the people that were oppressed, and so like we read it from a place of non-oppression, of incredible privilege, of not really having many overlords over us. But most of the people that are hearing the gospel for the first time, they hear it from the natural. Oh yeah. People are oppressed. There are people higher above us. That's just kind of the natural order of things. And so you'd even wonder, like I wonder in my mind, and maybe I need to do some more research on this. Like when I think about the first people that are reading the Gospels, is that the do they have to almost do the opposite filter of like, are they that sounds wrong. Like, is their perspective so much like a given that anybody reading this would be somebody under the thumb or under the boot of empire or whatever, that like it's hard for them to see anything. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing is, so the people that are writing this, it'd be like, hey, by the way, guys, everybody's listening, we're breathing air here. Mm-hmm. And everybody'd be like, okay, yeah. Everybody is. And then 5 minutes later, I'm like, hey, by the way, we're breathing air. And it's like they wrote it under oppression. They were born under oppression. They died and they were under oppression. They assumed their readers would live and die under oppression. So that is really, really important. Mm-hmm. And back to that perplexion. Yes, the Pharisees hold power and the tax collectors hold power, and I could resent both of them, if I lived in that world, because they certainly had more luxury and more freedom than typically the normal person, the average person, I guess. But it's that idea of, if I'm coming into a system, I want to know and I'm supposed to change that system and have a sense that God wants me to change that system. I think top down is not God's way. I can't think of an example where it really is. But can't we be top negotiating? Like if he came along and, what's that, you attract more people with flies or with honey than, whatever. But it is that idea of, what if he came in and said, hey, can I meet with a few guys and I make my case and I'm not making, I don't think he made Nicodemus meet him at night, but there is that sense that was orchestrated. And I think that idea of saying, here's all the good you've done. Here's all the good you've done. Now here's how let's look at this passage and do this. But instead, and I think about this, if I'm wanting to discuss something with Heather that I want her to change, if I wait till we're arguing about it, which I mostly do, it doesn't go well. And then after the argument, I don't know if it didn't go well because the energy I brought, because it was in an argument, or because she rejected the thought. And so if I'm going to have change in that area, I've got to calm down, think about how that change affects her, speak to that. And Jesus is obviously intelligent enough to know this. So there's a specific reason that he starts with the lowest rungs of society and allows his interactions with Pharisees to be with when they're drawn to the news and they're doing just local cleanup, And I don't want to assume that I would spend half an hour with Jesus and have a full sense of him being, he's obviously the Messiah and he's obviously for the good and he's obviously with God, because his own apostles didn't get that right away. And so it is perplexing. Why not try to do it.
Sure. Well, you almost, like, if I were to think back to something that God did in the past, you could think back. I totally agree with you. God does tend to start bottom up. He starts with mustard seed and grows. But I'm like, okay, well, if I think back to the Old Testament, what's an example I could have where I would think would make sense? You go in Jesus' own line. You go back to David, shepherd boy, younger brother, not as important, whatever. And then he kills Goliath, and then suddenly, like, he's now palling around with Saul, and there's 1,000 other stories that happen with that. You would think okay, well, if I was going to follow the pattern that God had done before, Jesus starts off really small, but then he does some miracles, and then, like, okay, now he's got the high priest who's, like, kind of interested, but there's this really weird tension of maybe it's almost exact mirror of Saul, where he's, like, in his favor, then he's not, or like, that would be what you'd almost expect, like, if you were just going to assume that it would happen, and maybe there's some even acknowledgement in or some, not acknowledgement, but, like, when you think about the life of David and his relationship with Saul, that as God was doing something new and building up through smaller, like, you think about, okay, what would it look like if Jesus had struck up a really strong relationship with the high priest, or with many of the Pharisees or the Sadducees? What would that look like? Suddenly, what would that look like? And you wonder, like, what if that would have been what had happened? Like, what if it had suddenly devolved into this, into maybe some of the more unhealthy dynamics that Jesus and that David and Saul devolved into, and thus, like, Jesus couldn't do so much of the ministry that he wanted to. Like, maybe in some ways it had to have been an either or situation. Like, I obviously want my cake to eat it too. Like, I want Jesus to be able to going to the sick and the people who know they're sick, but also be dealing, negotiating, having some nuance with the people on top. But maybe there's a reality that there's I'm not going to say, like, for everybody, but maybe it's just true for Jesus that, like, as much as I want that to be an option, maybe that option is not as there as I often like to think it is.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I really appreciate that. And how would he have to alter his message? Because I know I alter my message. Because I'm thinking, I'm not going to tell them this yet. I'm gonna find common ground with them, and then gradually I'm going to share. Hey, and here's some other things to consider. So if I'm dealing with a person that I know is an atheist, I'm like, do you like being good to people? Okay, we can agree on that, and this kind of thing. And then I wait for these things to happen. And certainly I have a different mission than Jesus. I have the same mission in the sense to bring glory to God, but I'm on a different path than Jesus was. In other words, I don't anticipate dying on a cross, and and I know my death wouldn't bring back I wouldn't have the world sins forgiven, that kind of thing. But it is that, and I think it comes down to, what do I do with this exactly? Yeah. Is there a place? And it's not like I'm rubbing shoulders with a lot of powerful people, but even within a system, if you want to get to the children, when I was a youth minister, you want to make peace with the parents, so that you have some latitude and so you can affect them.
Sure.
And I do think it's very interesting.
It is interesting, and I do buy your thought that there are quite a few Pharisees who are well-intentioned, who are scared, and who are not all egotistical power. I think there's enough. I think there's plenty of evidence for that in the Gospels, and historical. But I do wonder. You think about your example when you were a youth minister, and, like, knowing, okay, there's a certain level of relationship to get the kids to not get to the kids. It sounds kind of sinister, but to have like good, healthy, good relationship with the kids. Like, there's got to be a level of negotiation with the parents and gaining their trust. I do wonder, does that change for us because we operate in such, relatively speaking, we operate in a really high trust society, and, like, a lot of goodwill, like, is kind of a given. But if suddenly if you became convinced the bulk of your kids' parents were not just, like, they had bad priorities, like they were, but, like, were completely wrong about Jesus. Like, let's just say that, like, they completely had missed the boat on God. Like, nearly every one of your parents, like, maybe there's a few that kind of got it, but their perception were just so wildly off. Like, then it becomes like, how do I negotiate between these parents who are teaching their kids all these things that I think are just wildly untrue about God and unhealthy and unhelpful. And then you go like, okay, could I see a scenario where it's like, obviously I'm not going to be like, your parents are evil and bad and this sort of thing, especially if I want to keep my job. But does there become a time where it becomes where you do have to have I just got to put my, I got to put my head down and minister to these kids as long as I'm here, as long as I'm able to.
Yeah, and I think it illustrates, I want to get to what perplexes you, but it illustrates context.
Yeah.
And the fact that I'm not an expert in this context, and what I know is valuable, but it's not the whole picture. But I do appreciate that. And the other thing is time. Jesus, for whatever reason, doesn't start his ministry till the last few years of his life. And by whatever reason, I understand most rabbis didn't come on until 30, but also most rabbis weren't in almost immediate conflict with all the other rabbis. But it is that idea, his mission largely defined how he did his mission. And where I think of my mission as over the next 5, 10, 20 years, he was very specific about, I don't think he knew every single thing that was going to happen, but he was very specific about, all right, I'm doing this to set up this, which sets up this.
Yeah.
And that is good thinking. I mean, I think he wasn't thinking in, I'm gonna build the foundation for the next 10 years, and then I will ... So I think that's good. So what perplexes you?
What perplexes me is funny because you almost kind of incidentally touched on it, maybe as a part of a joke very early on in the episode, or maybe it was before we even recorded. I don't know. But Matthew puts in this story about himself. And I want so much more because you can hear Jesus tell another disciple, hey, come and follow me. And it's like, well, they weren't, I obviously want more what's going on in their heart, what was going on in their head, what's happening. But with Matthew here, I'm like, man, I want to know what so moved. And there's some other things, but this, I feel like if there was ever going to be a point in the Gospels where we stopped and we're like, well, and here's exactly how I felt, or maybe the fact that isn't there so strongly, maybe it's meant to teach us something about maybe I don't know, maybe when we choose to follow Jesus, maybe it doesn't have to be 1,000 logical reasons build up, or I want more, and I'm perplexed at why. And again, in my 21st century brain, it makes sense that this would be the moment. And again, maybe somebody reading for the first time back in the first century would not think, oh, this is the moment where this happens. Maybe there's a cultural thing where there's something about how ancient biographies were written that I just can't comprehend, but I'm just left baffled.
Right. And this reflects for me just a larger, there are details left out that I'm like, that would have been so helpful. Even some self-talk. And when Jesus called Matthew, he was thinking about, man, I'm going to have to give up all this because he's functionally, there's a similarity in the rich young ruler and him, because if he just gives up, and that's the sense, it doesn't say it specifically in the text that he never returned to being a tax collector, but we assume he's walking away from that lifestyle and there's no sense of him returning to it.
Yeah.
And so it is, I mean, there is a huge cost here. Yeah. And to some degree, I have no idea what the other, we know some of them were fishermen, but in general, we don't know if they were good fishermen, bad fishermen. Sure. We don't know how they were doing.
And there's no reasonable expectation for complete image rehabilitation. There's not like right after this, the Jesus disciples are going to be in conflict with the Pharisees, with the religious leaders. So it's the people leading, you would love to know, man, the day before, did Matthew brutally, did he unfairly tax a family and it just ate him up all night? And he just, what was it? And again, that's something we can't know forever, but I'm just so, I just wish so much that we had it, because I think about how valuable that would be. I don't know. And again, I have this temptation to want to be like, well, okay, maybe there's this and that. And I think maybe there's times where that's good, and I do that all the time. But I'm just left in this place of man, I can come up with a lot of reasons why it's not the case, but I'm still just man, I'm just gonna own the fact that even though I know a lot of the reasons, I'm still just gonna own the fact that but I still feel what makes sense to me would be better, and I recognize that is not humble in any way, And I don't want to have that perspective. I don't necessarily want to have that perspective, but I want to own that's where my mind is right now.
Yeah. And I think in general, this idea of wanting more is so us. And one of the constant themes that we don't intend necessarily, but it keeps coming up, is the idea that wanting more or receiving the more that you want may not help you as much as you think it would. And that's what I'm saying to my own heart here, because there's so much more I want when I dig into this. I'm like, well, what about this and what about that? And I think on one hand, God always has more, and he's given me a lot more over the years. But I recognize that the dynamic of trusting God, when it's about I've got to know more and then I will trust, what I'm really saying is I'm trusting my understanding. And that's not the same as just trusting God. And oftentimes it's when I get into a zone in my life, a crisis, a tragedy, that I realize I don't think I'm ever going to understand this. If you're ever with a family and they lose somebody, reflecting on Avery's loss, which we spoke to a few months ago, there's no way to explain it. Like, you may have a sense, you may have some thoughts of what God may do with it, but at the end of the day, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And I don't know if more understanding, if God came to me and said, hey, here's all the reasons I did it. On the other side of it, I don't know if it will help me that much. It may help my understanding, but it may not help me trust God.
Yeah.
Because he just works in a plane. When we say his ways are higher than their ways, it feels like, oh, they're so benevolent and beautiful. But it's like, I think it would also involve things that I'm like, but couldn't you have done it another way? Mm-hmm. It's just kind of the nature of following God.
That's good. So it's like when I think wanting more of God is always good, but is my desire, I always even demand from God for more of him. Does that feed into my leaning on my own understanding, or is it more about wanting more of God? And so that's the helpful. I think that's the helpful line for me of when, because I think it's good. I think it's an objective good thing to not just want more, but to ask and maybe even rightfully as a son to the Father demand more of God, because I believe he wants to give more to us. But the helpful line for me becomes, do I want more of God because, like, for him, or do I want more of him or more of his stuff or more of his things, so that I can prop myself up better? Grace, peace, and love.